And we see that here. And we should not treat God as this fellow suggests, not treat God as a robot. God is not some remote, uncaring, unfeeling presence, but rather he is he desires a direct and intimate relationship with each and every one of us, and we should remember that. All right, so now we get into the next section here. And of course, this is where God begins now to give his instruction to Noah, because Noah has found grace in the eyes of God, because Noah was still making an effort to be righteous. And so here we see in chapter 6, starting here in verse 9, well, at the end of verse 8 there, of course, Noah found favor in the eyes of God. And these are the records of the generation of Noah. Noah was a righteous man. Notice that characterization of Noah. He is a righteous man. We've had that same kind of notice about other men before him, especially, well, I want to say Enoch, but Enoch was never described as a righteous man necessarily. But here's Noah described as a righteous man. Blameless in his time, Noah walked with God. Now, we did see that Enoch walked with God. And so this seems to be a characteristic of these righteous men. They walk with God. And the only way walking with God, as Amos says, the book of Amos said, can two walk together unless they are agreed? And here we find Noah walking with God, in agreement with God. The earth was corrupt in the sight of God, and the earth was filled with violence. And God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, and all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. Then God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence because of them, and behold, I'm about to destroy them with the earth. Make for yourself an ark of gopher wood, and you shall make the ark with rooms, and you shall cover it inside and out with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. You shall make a window for the ark, and finish it to a cubit from the top, and set the door of the ark on the side. You shall make it with lower, second, and third decks. And behold, even I, am bringing the flood of water upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under the heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall perish. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall enter the ark, you and your sons and your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you, and they shall be male and female. Of the birds after their kind, and of the animals after their kind, of every creeping thing of the ground after its kind, 2 of every kind shall you come to keep them alive. And as for you, take for yourself some of all food which is edible, and gather it to yourself, and it shall be for food for you and for them. Thus Noah did according to all that God had commanded, so he did. And I would emphasize that last phrase there, because the author repeats, and by means of repetition shows that Noah was faithful to fulfill everything that God had commanded him. We sometimes use this example, I know, in discussions with people talking about Noah's faith, and we talk about the question of faith only. And here is a man who, yes, had faith, had great faith, but his faith was expressed by his actions. And as everything that God, as this verse points out, everything that Noah commanded, or that God commanded, Noah did. We get here into the ark. This is one of the more controversial areas of the Bible, and it's mainly because there's a lot of folks that don't like the implications of this. The evolutionist, of course, loathes this section because it completely destroys that philosophy, that concept. But as we go into this, we're going to find out that I'm going to be examining some of the facts about the ark. This is just plain facts about it, and make some conclusions based on those facts. The word ark here is from the Hebrew word. It means simply a chest or a box. It's simply a container. And all it had to do was float, by the way. That's all it had to do. You will notice, as it is described here, it has no sails, it has no rudder. It was never intended to go anywhere, be guided by sail or rudder. It was simply intended to float. All it had to do was float. It says God told Moses to make it out of gopher wood. Well, what's gopher wood? A lot of conjecture about what gopher wood might have meant. Some suggest that it might have been a dense wood, such as teak, which we know that teak is still used for the construction of boats today. Some of others have suggested it was a resinous wood, such as cypress or cedar, also used for boat construction. Yet others would suggest that gopher wood may have been some kind of a processed wood product, such as a plywood. We don't know what the actual means or methodology was. What kind of wood gopher wood actually meant, we don't know. We just know that it was a wood that was apparently suitable for the construction of this project. If we use a cubit, then if we take the measurement of a cubit, and here's a standard cubit of about 18 inches, because that cubit was the measurement from a man's elbow to the tip of his finger. That was the typical measurement. And so a standard cubit was 18 inches. Then the ark is 450 feet long, 75 feet tall, and 45 feet wide. And we kind of try and get a grasp of that and think about what that size means. Well, it was bigger. It was about a football field is 300 feet long. And so if you think of the ark, here is the length of a football field and then half of one again, that long. And on height and the other dimensions, about 4 stories tall. This is an interesting photograph. This was published about a year ago by a fellow. This was a fellow in the Netherlands who decided he would build an ark and see if it was possible. And so he built this ark. It is, according to this article, 4 stories tall, longer than a football pitch. And it's a real life Noah's Ark that this fellow built. You can get some idea of the scale of the thing from the people here that are standing here beside it. But he built it in about 3 years. So, that Noah could, one of the arguments against one of the skeptics' point of argument about Noah's Ark is, well, how could he have built this thing in 100 years? Well, this fellow built one in 3 years. Now, of course, he probably used modern power tools and he used some other shortcuts, but it does point out that the thing could be built and could be built rather straightforwardly. Here is some scale of the boat that he built, and you can see some sense of it here in this photograph where Noah had built this. Some of the arguments that the skeptics want to use against the ark is that, well, it doesn't have enough space. It doesn't have enough space to hold all the animals. There's something like 8 million species they will pontificate, and therefore couldn't hold all those animals. Plus, you would have had to have space for the food, for the waste, and all that for the amount of time they were in the ark. No, it's just impossible. So that's one of the arguments. Another one of the arguments is that the ark wasn't seaworthy enough. Why, if you had a boat like that, it would roll over, it would sink. It's not seaworthy. Couldn't survive the kind of waves, the kind of ocean conditions that it would have been exposed to. Yes, sir. Yeah.
I've seen another design possibility for the ark. I don't know whether that's probably don't know whether that's a valid standard. The other design shows a higher protruder that's coming up here.
Yeah.
About this far.
Yeah.
Which would constitute a riding sail.
Uh-huh.
Which would help to hold the ark into the wind so it would handle the waves a lot. And I think that's a better suggestion.
Yes, I have seen, yes, John's got a point here that there are a number of possible designs. If you go, for example, if you go onto Google and you were to Google under images, a Noah's Ark, you will see a number of representations. Some of them make it to me just a pure box. I mean, it's just drawn up like a pure box. Others have put on it some kind of a bow-like structure with the idea that it could ride the waves better. We don't know. We don't know if it had such a structure like that or not. Others have presented, as John says, a protuberance off the bow of the craft, where it could therefore act as a little bit of a sail, so that it would be turned by the wind into the wind and would ride waves better. There are a number of artist conceptions, if you will, of the picture of this box. Well, it's 3 decks. Yeah, it's 3 decks, but they're saying the overall structure would be 4 stories tall. And so you would have, 4 decks or 3 decks built into a structure that is 4 stories tall. They argue that it would be impossible to collect the animals from all of the continents of the earth. For example, how do you get the kangaroos and some of the other marsupial animals out of Australia? How do you get those animals over to the ark? So they argue on that line. They would say, no, wait a minute, there would be too much heat buildup within the ark. It would get too hot inside the ark with all those animals and all of the decomposing waste matter and what have you. It would just be just this incredibly hot space, and therefore the animals would die. And then after the animals are released, we find animals in separate and distinct locations. For example, you find buffalo only on the North American continent. You find kangaroos only in Australia, and you find these animals that are in these geographic locations, and only in those locations. Pandas are found only in China, for example, and therefore then it makes no sense then that all of these animals came aboard the ark and then they all dispersed once they left. Why don't we find pandas in South America? Why don't we find kangaroos in Russia, et cetera, as part of their arguments? This is just a few of the arguments that we get from the folks that are skeptical about the ark. Here's some of the arguments, though, that are for the ark. Given that the dimensions of the ark that we have, that 450 feet long by 45 feet tall by 80 feet wide, the total volume inside the ark is at 1.4 million cubic feet. And to give you some comparable measurement, that's the equivalent volume of about 522 railroad cars. And so you can think about a train, 522 railroad cars long. That's how much that ark could hold. With 3 decks, it would have had a capacity. The engineers that have studied this and looked at the seaworthiness of this vessel say that it could have held 17,000 tons of stuff. Okay? So given that you had 17,000 tons of stuff, we take an animal. Now, the Bible doesn't say take an animal from each species. Species, by the way, is a man-made conception to take the animals and break them down. It says it took one animal of each kind. Well, if we go back to one of the animals from each genus of the animals, not species, we would have roughly 16,000 animals to be taken into the ark. given that we got 16,000 animals, if we each animal, the average weight of these animals is 100 pounds. And if you can imagine, think about the range of animals that you would have. Elephants, of course, are going to weigh more, and larger animals obviously going to weigh more. The sea animals, of course, are not going to be are going to continue in the sea. They're not going to be, you're not going to be pulling a blue whale up onto the deck of the ark. It can stay in the sea. And so we're talking about land animals, and a lot of land animals are going to weigh more than 100 pounds, but a lot of them are going to weigh less than 100 pounds. And so if you take an average weight of an animal at 100 pounds, you've got about 800 tons of animals. You add about 3,000 tons for food, about 5,000 tons for water, and even that, the total mass there is less than 900 tons, or 9,000 tons, beg your pardon, 9,000 tons. You still have a capacity of over 7,000 tons of cargo space you could carry. So the idea of bringing these animals on board the ark and having space for them is not impossible. It's not out of the realm of reason. The hydrodynamic studies that have been done on the ark show that it could have withstood waves as high as 200 feet and recovered itself from a 90-degree list. So if you can imagine here's the ark, and if their wave were to come along and rock it even to 90 degrees on one side or the other, it would still right itself. And so is it seaworthy? Yes, it could ride the waves. It could ride even a fairly violent storm right out through a storm. We noticed that the ark was built with windows. It was built with ventilation included. The thermal modeling of the ark has shown that with the windows that had been instructed by God to be included, that the heat buildup in the interior would not have been excessive. That heat would have escaped out of these windows, and it would have been stayed at a reasonable temperature on the interior of the ark. And then there is theories on the pre-flood geography suggesting the idea that instead of the separate continents as we know them now, that the earth was composed of one continent called Pangaea by some of the geologists. And these Pangaea then split into the separate continents. Of course, a lot of the geologists believe this occurred over millions or even billions of years, but there are theories, and I'll show you that hopefully in a few minutes, that this occurred in a relatively rapid time. And that what happened then was that there were naturally occurring land bridges. Animals, once they left the ark, they used these land bridges to go off where they would, and some of them then, because of the geography and the climate where they ended up, some of them thrived and they found favorable biological niches, and therefore the animals, we end up with just kangaroos in Australia and pandas only in China. Notice then we go into any questions on chapter 6, on the end of chapter 6 here. We go into chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. After 7 more days, I will send rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. Notice that God calls Noah into the ark here in chapter 7 and verse 1. Then the Lord said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me at this time. We find this example throughout the scriptures where God calls men to do what he wants them to do, to be saved. And so here is God calling Noah into the ark. We see that God called Abraham to leave his home in Ur of the Chaldees and go into Canaan. We see that God calls men today through his word to obey him. And so here we have that, if we follow that example of man hearing the voice of God and obeying him. It says here that you will take with you of every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his female. Also of the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of the earth. And after 7 more days, I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made. And Noah did according to all that God had commanded him. Now, again, here's verse 2 and 3. You shall take with you of every clean animal by sevens. Does that contradict with what we see back in chapter 6 and verses 19 to 21, where it says, you will take of every living thing of all flesh, you will bring 2 of every kind into the ark. And so here's chapter 6 saying you'll bring in 2, and here's chapter 7. Well, wait a minute. Of one group of the unclean animals, you're going to bring in 2, but of the clean animals, you're going to bring in 7. No, there really is no contradiction here. There is a suggestion here that animals at this point are being used by food or for food. Some disagreement on that, depending on who you listen to. But there is apparently a distinction between clean and unclean animals that God had made for purposes of his own. We don't know exactly what that purpose was. It may have been as food. It may have been for other purposes. But there is some sense here that there is some thought here that perhaps some of these animals would be then used as a food supply during this event of being in the ark, during the time of being in the ark. I wanted to point out this too, that we talk about here's Noah's flood, and we think about Noah's flood, and yet we find a number of other stories of flood throughout human civilization. We find it scattered throughout all human civilization. There is stories of a great flood. One of the most famous one, of course, is the Assyrian epic of Gilgamesh, which occurs on texts written some 3,000 years is the understanding. 3,000 years, I believe, before Christ. And here is this flood story from Babylon, from Assyria, of this epic of Gilgamesh, with a number of parallels between the Genesis account and this account of a man who is called to bring his family into a large boat. He brings the family into the large boat along with all of the animals. They are all saved from a great flood, and then he is given instruction afterward to populate the earth by the gods who had instructed him to come into this vessel. There is a Sumerian story of a character named Zidusura, again with an account of a flood, a great flood, a destruction of the earth, and a subsequent repopulation. China has a story of Yu the Great. In this case, it is here the flood comes up out of the, I believe, out of the Yangtze River. In their story, I believe Yu cuts off the top of a mountain in order to have a place to land his vessel, if I remember the story right. In India, there is a man and a woman, Manu and Matsuya, who are brought into a boat, and they are instructed to gather animals, and they are to survive this flood by being in this boat. So we have that in the Indian culture. In the North American Native Americans, the Hopi Indians, here they have a story of their god named Tawa. The Tawa destroys the world by flood, but the people are saved. There are people that are saved by hiding in a hollow reed. And so they are able to hide in this hollow reed and float to safety, and they survived the flood that way. Here's an account from the Maasai out of Africa. I found this one to be particularly interesting, so I copied some more of the text. But notice the parallels that we have here from this account out of from the Maasai out of Africa with what we find in Genesis. It says, once upon a time, the rivers began to flood. Then God told two people to get into a ship. He told them to take lots of seed and to take lots of animals. The water of the flood eventually covered the mountains. Finally, the flood stopped. Then one of the men, wanting to know if the water had dried up, let a dove loose. The dove returned. Later, he let loose a hawk, which did not return. Then the men left the boat and took the animals and the seeds with them. And so here we have this account from the Maasai out of Africa as part of their culture, part of their cultural stories, and very much an account much like Genesis. And so interestingly enough, as we look at the Genesis account, as we read through the story of Noah and of the flood, when we find this story echoed throughout a number of civilizations, this is a very short list. If you want to look this up on, actually, I found this out of a site on Wikipedia, but if you look on that site, you will find similar accounts from a number of other cultures that are listed there, from South America, from Australia, and other locations, all of them with a parallel account of this great flood and of the salvation of man in a boat. Now, how does this work? Well, here's one of the theories of how this may have came to be, because you read the account of the flood as it comes here in 6 through 12. Noah was 600 years old when the flood of water came upon the earth. Then Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him entered the ark because of the water of the flood. All of clean animals and animals that are not clean, and of birds and of everything that creeps on the ground, there went into the ark of Noah by twos, male and female, as God had commanded Noah. And it came about after 7 days that the water of the flood came upon the earth. And in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, and on the 17th day of the month, on that same day, all of the fountains of the deep burst forth open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened. And the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And here's a fellow who had looked at this and had come up with a theory about it that's gotten some interest, a lot of controversy too, by the way. Let me see if I can connect up. May have to skip over a commercial first. Sorry. I got the sound on. Turn it on where? Well, I'm hearing it through my speakers up here, but well, I'm not now because I'm plugged into the output. Let me back this. Wait and see if Dave can get the sound up. How do you mean? Well, I should have, yes. I should have tested this beforehand instead of just throwing it on Dave at the last second, but I'm plugged in all the way. Well, I'll tell you what he's saying. This fella we see here, he is Yeah.
This theory shows us just how rapidly major mountains form. It explains the coal, oil, and methane deposits.
I don't know if we can hear that or not.
And why the ocean? On the ocean floor, there are huge trenches, hundreds of canyons, and tens of thousands of volcanoes. This theory also explains the ice ages, and it gives the primary reason for global warming. It explains the formation of the layered strata in almost all fossils, the frozen mammoths, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. Surprisingly, it explains the origin of comets, asteroids, and of meteorites.
According to Dr. Brown's theory, the ancient world that Noah lived in was very different from the Earth we occupy today.
Noah and other pre-flood people probably lived on one very large supercontinent with lush vegetation, inland seas, and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, perhaps 6,000 feet high. Before the flood, about half the Earth's water was in interconnected chambers, about 10 miles below the Earth's surface. This formed a thin spherical shell almost a mile thick. The pressure in the subterranean chamber had been increasing for centuries because the gravity of the sun and moon produced tides in the subterranean water that lifted and lowered the Earth's massive crust twice a day. This tidal pumping added gigantic amounts of energy to the subterranean water. This increasing pressure in the subterranean water steadily stretched the crust as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began as a microscopic crack that grew in both directions at almost 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, circled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a ripped in a tightly stretched claw. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. The Bible even gives us a precise date, the 600th year of Noah's life, 17th day, the second month. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst open. Then it says, and the rain fell. The fountains of water jetted supersonically into and above the atmosphere. The spray from these enormous fountains produced torrential rain such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The supersonic fountains eroded the crumbling rock on both sides of the widening crack. This produced huge volumes of sediments that settled through floodwater, trapping and burying plants and animals, forming the fossil record. Eventually, the crack became so wide that the newly exposed floor of the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, with lubricating water still beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of approximately 40 to 50 miles per hour, they ran into resistances. And like a runaway crashing train, they compressed, crushed, buckled, and thickened, rising out of the floodwaters. This is why the major mountains are generally parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. Today's major mountains were all pushed up in hours. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the mid-Atlantic ridge, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated.
This theory of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity appears to support the biblical story of the deluge in every detail. But what other evidence exists to support this amazing?
Can't hear it.
In 1970, I predicted that large pools of salt water would be found beneath major mountains. That prediction has been confirmed in several ways, by gravity studies, by seismic studies, by electromagnetic studies.
A paper published in the April 2001 issue of Science
It's your
magazine
personal thing
announced
all
the
the way up?
discovery of
Yes.
an electrically conductive layer under the Tibetan Plateau. The article suggested that such high conductivity at depths of approximately 10 miles could be achieved by a layer of aqueous fluids, some 1.6 kilometers thick and containing 10%.
And I'll stop that if it
In other words,
can't be heard.
It can't be heard. It'd be better.
All right. I'll play it. I'll try and play this next week. But
That's the name of the hypothetical.
yes.
His name is Brown, Dr. Brown. He's an MIT PhD in mechanical engineering, and he has looked at this and come up with this theory. Obviously, it's controversial theory, but the theory is that the Earth would have been one large continent at the time of Noah. That there was a split then. The great volumes of water would have been existing below the plates that the continent was riding on, and that as that plate split, these great volumes of water would have come jetting up out of the ground at under enormous pressures, and this would have been the fountains of the deep opening, as we see in Genesis, and it would have caused this split of the earth, the mass of the earth. They would have literally slid across the face of the earth, sort of like skipping a rock across water, and they would have run into other land masses. They would have mounted up into some of the mountain ranges that we find today. But yeah, I'll try and get this up for next week a little better and maybe show it again. But I wanted you to hear about that theory. It's relatively new and I think fairly interesting as far as an explanation for what we find in the book of Genesis. I'm going to stop there then for today, and we'll continue next week. I appreciate your attention today. Yeah. Yeah, there's tremendous pressure there. And the idea is that we have that same tremendous pressure. We would have had a much more enormous amount of pressure at the time of the flood.